till Globala torget Play. Äntligen är vi igång. Det här eventet som vi har väntat på så länge. ACT, Svenska kyrkan och Forum SIV, vi inleder det här. Vi inledde denna förmiddag med att prata om hur vi ska stärka de mest utsatta efter coronakrisen. Och hur vi kan göra en omstart mot en mer hållbar värld där ingen lämnas utanför. Det vill säga Build Back Better. Jag heter Anna Stenvinkel och jag jobbar som generalsekreterare på Forum SIV. Och jag ska börja med att guida er under den här första delen av förmiddagen. Coronapandemin har visat att tillgång till social trygghet, allmän sjukvård, sjuk- och arbetslöshetsförsäkring och kontanta stöd i sårbara livssituationer och krissituationer är helt avgörande för hur både individer och samhällen klarar kriser. Idag ska vi diskutera hur det internationella samfundet och deras möjligheter faktiskt för att kunna stödja de som drabbas värst och hårdast i coronakrisen. Vilka speciella behov har grupper som är mest utsatta i coronakrisen? Vi hör ju mycket om det, men vad är deras behov? Det ska vi prata om. Hur kan vi möta dem på bästa sätt? Hur ska de här sociala trygghetssystemen utformas för att nå de som är mest utsatta? Och hur kan det internationella samfundet hjälpa länder i det här arbetet? Hur kan vi tänka långsiktigt i det akuta arbetet? Hur kan vi ha de här två tankarna i huvudet samtidigt, det akuta och det långsiktiga, så att vi kan bidra till ett långsiktigt hållbart samhällsbygge där ingen lämnas utanför? Idag har vi spännande punkter på vårt program. Vi kommer börja med en keynote där vi ska prata om How do we support the most vulnerable in the coronavirus crisis? Och här har vi möjlighet att få lyssna till Ulrika Moder från UNDP. Och vi ska också samtala med Ugo Gentilini från Världsbanken. Sen går vi vidare och pratar om från nödhjälp till samhällsbygget, det här brobygget däremellan. Och här ska ACT, Svenska kyrkan, presentera en ny rapport om social trygghet i coronakrisen. Mycket spännande. Unga är särskilt utsatta i denna kris och det ska vi också prata om i Omstart världen, ungas framtid. Och där arrangerar vi Forum SIV tillsammans med Nicola Jones från Overseas Development Institute. Och så avslutar vi med en panel där vi pratar om Leaving No One Behind while Build Back Better. Och här kommer då vi lyssna på Karin Jämtin från Sida och Isabel Fry från Studies in Poverty and Equality Institute i Sydafrika. Så det hoppas jag att ni kommer tycka är spännande, allt detta som vi ska lyssna på. Ni kan också komma ihåg att ni kan under hela tiden ställa frågor. Dels via den chatt som finns i Facebook, men så vet jag också att det finns några av er som tittar på OnVent. Här kan ni också ställa frågor. Det här samtalet som vi gör, det är också en del av ett initiativ som heter Omstart världen. Vi var några organisationer här under våren som ville verkligen uppmärksamma hur viktigt biståndet är. Bistånd är alltid viktigt, men under pandemin har vi sett att det är viktigare än någonsin. Och hur kan vi tillsammans bidra med detta och visa resultat, visa vad vi gör och få fler människor att förstå detta? Det här gör vi tillsammans med Sida och de här grejerna som vi gör idag är en del av Omstart världen. Men hörrni, innan vi nu sätter igång så ska vi använda oss av Menti. För vi har 2 stycken frågor och då går ni in antingen via er mobil eller också gör ni det via datorn och då går ni in på menti.com. Och så finns det en kod som är 9455705 och den ska ni också ha i bild så att ni kan se den. Men 9455705. Och den första frågan, då vill vi veta lite grann, vilka är det nu då som tittar på det här? Är du engagerad i civilsamhället? Eller jobbar du kanske på en myndighet? Är du forskare? Lyssnar du som privatperson eller identifierar du helt enkelt som någonting annat än det? Så varsågoda och svara på den här första frågan i Menti. Ska vi se, kommer det upp här bakom mig? Ja, vi har i alla fall en från civilsamhället som lyssnar, det tycker jag känns betryggande. Vi ska se om det kommer in några fler också. 2 stycken till och med, fantastiskt. Det är ju också så fiffigt med de här sändningarna att även om man inte har möjlighet att titta nu i direktsändning så kan man ju titta senare också. En privatperson också, härligt. Ja, ska vi ge några sekunder till så ska vi se om det är några av er till som svarar på detta. Och vilka ni är. Ja, en forskare också, 5 från civilsamhället och en enda. Och en myndighetsanställd också, underbart. Vad härligt hörni. Jag tycker vi går vidare till nästa fråga. Och då är det, vad ser du som den största utmaningen med att stärka de mest utsatta? Det finns ju många utmaningar, men vad är den största utmaningen? Varsågoda och skriv in det. Och här är det fritext, så här kan ni skriva själva. Vad ser ni för någonting? Varsågoda. Ja, ska vi se om det kommer upp någonting här då. Kan jag tänka mig att det kanske tar lite längre tid eftersom det inte är förinkryssade alternativ utan det är fritext. Och jag gissar att det finns ganska många utmaningar så det kanske tar en liten stund att skriva detta. Så ska vi se om det dyker upp någonting på skärmen här för oss i utmaningar. Och är det så nu att inte ni kan få in detta ordentligt så kommer det också någonting som självklart våra panelister och deltagare kommer att prata om. Här har vi ökad ojämlikhet och resurser. Ja, absolut. De här är ju väldigt, väldigt viktiga och stora utmaningar och det kommer vi att beröra under dagen också. Se om det kommer upp något mer. Jajamän. Fler med många resurser, bristen på sociala trygghetssystem som når de mest utsatta och avsaknad sociala trygghetssystem. Då är ni ju i rätt webbinarium kan vi säga, för det är precis de här sakerna vi ska prata om idag. Tusen tack för detta. Jag hoppas det kanske kommer in ytterligare några stycken i det här. Men då går vi vidare till helt enkelt det som är första programpunkten och då kommer vi gå över till engelska här. So we will move on now to the keynote, which will be how do we support the most vulnerable in the coronavirus crisis. And we'll start by focusing on how people are affected actually by the pandemic and how the most important actions taken by the international community to support the most vulnerable. For this discussion, we have invited Ulrika Moder, who is Assistant Secretary General and Director of Bureau of External Relations and Advocacy at UNDP. We also will talk to Ugo Gentilini, who is Senior Economist with the Social Protection and Jobs Global Practice at the World Bank. Very much welcome to both of you. Actually, I spoke with Ulrika the day before yesterday, so we will start by listening to what she had to say upon these issues. Ska jag säga något eller? Ska jag säga det? Eller ska jag sitta där? Okej hörni, vi har lite tekniska problem med ljudet på filmen så att nu håller alla dessa tekniker som jobbar febrilt här i bakgrunden med att fixa detta. Så ha lite tålamod så kommer den här filmen alldeles strax. Det är ju så här som alltid den stora utmaningen när man kör både teknik på olika sätt att det kan strula lite grann. Men nu ska vi se, nu är det igång eller? Ja, härligt. Då så, då tittar vi på Ulrika.
Hi Ulrika, how are you today?
Hi Anna, I'm fine. The world is not so fine, but I'm fine. Good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you too. We will talk about how we can support the most vulnerable during this pandemic. This is what we're going to speak about today. And I have some questions for you, and I hope you can be able to answer them for me. But I think we will start out by how would you say people are affected both by the pandemic as such, but also by the measures taken during this situation? And I mean, you know, about the general health issues, education, and which would you say would be the most vulnerable groups in this situation we have now?
So I think that the pandemic, I mean, of course, it's a health crisis and it's going on as we speak with increasing numbers of people being affected. But it's also then, of course, a humanitarian crisis. And from the UN, we see 100 million being pushed into extreme poverty as we speak. But it's also a very deep and what we believe can be a very protracted socioeconomic crisis. So the wider impact of the lockdowns and economies affected by the pandemic, we have not seen the full result of this yet. But what we know is that people are losing their jobs. We're talking about 300 million lost job opportunities. And then, of course, we can't even count the number of people in the informal sector because actually 60% of people are working in the informal sector across the world. So the impact, the wider impact, and the length of what we will see with regard to the impact is just immense. And UNDP, United Nations Development Programme, we issue a human development report, and we have looked at the data and done some analysis. And what we see is that actually for the first time since we started to measure in 1990, we will see that we go backwards in relation to human development. And then we can compare with the crisis in 2008, and that was not enough to really take us backwards. So in many countries, like in Sub-Saharan Africa, we're talking about 10 years of lost opportunities with regard to human development, and health, education, and the wider scale of measurement with regard to human development.
This is so sad, so sad that we're in this situation. Do you think that we could actually have any actions strong enough to sort of change this direction you just mentioned?
I think we can, because at the same time as we see countries, in lockdown, and we see a lot of populism and nationalism playing out, we also see that there is an increasing understanding with regard to how the world is actually interconnected, and the importance of the Sustainable Development Goals to look at economic sustainability in relation to social sustainability and environmental sustainability. So I believe that there is actually kind of a factfulness, in the words of Brotling, that could lay the ground for discussion. And more than that, we also see governments and actors investing heavily to combat the pandemic and the effects of the pandemic. So money is actually around. And what we need to see to now is that these investments takes us well beyond recovery and towards the Sustainable Development Goals. So we need to see governments responsible to, in the midst of the crisis, not just look at the immediate crisis, but actually build social security systems. One of the major problems with people who can't afford to stay at home is that they go out to the streets, of course, to look for job opportunities, income opportunities, and then the virus spread. So I think it's incredibly important also to see to that we do the long-term investments needed in the midst of the crisis, and how we can also shift some of the investments. So United Nations Development Programme, we have looked at this, the social security systems, the proposal of a temporary basic income in some countries that we have seen working. And perhaps we can also look at where this money could come from. We need to discuss the debt crisis. That will be a very important discussion onwards in so many countries without the possibility to do the right investments. But there are also subsidies that perhaps we could look at that could be invested in a different way. Fossil fuel subsidies could perhaps be invested in the building of social systems. So there are many opportunities as we go along, and I think that these discussions are starting. They're becoming important, and I would very much like to see civil society organizations also join us in these discussions, making full use of the UN platforms as we are celebrating also the 75th anniversary of the UN, recalling that it was in the charter said, "We the peoples." So we need to discuss these different solutions, and we need to do it together.
Yeah, and how do we do that then? Because this is something I find very important as well, because we need to be brave, we need to look outside the sort of the normal box, and we need to show leadership, and we need also to cooperate, as you say. We need to find new collaborations, but how will we do that? Because now we are, as you say, we talk about these things, we can see some different steps are taken, but how will we do this in real action? What would your sort of dream scenario be here?
So I think that the Sustainable Development Goals are a very important roadmaps, and we follow the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goal across the world. We can actually see what's working and what's not working. So the platform of the UN could be a good platform where both scientists and the academic institutions come together to provide that kind of institutional support to the analysis. We see also the improvement of data that gives us the possibility to have a proper discussion based on good data analysis, but then also to really look at the best practices within different sectors and how we can also have that integrated approach, because I think it's incredibly important now. Governments, decision makers, private sector actors, but also then of course civil society are incredibly stressed by the situation. So if we can come together and look at best practices and how integrated solutions, let's see now perhaps how we during the kickoff of the important year looking at biodiversity can see biodiversity and investment in biodiversity and nature-based solutions as something that can actually bring also our economy back on track. So the connection between the three areas of sustainability, economy, jobs, could be turned into green jobs. We can look at the social sector and how that can also help to strengthen the national economy alongside also with the local and personal economy of people living in poverty. And then, of course, something that is incredibly important that also concerns us is that we see an autocratization across the world. So lockdowns have also meant in many countries that there is less of discussion in the country, while we need to have more of discussion and more of meetings and new ideas being brought forward to the table. And there, of course, we need to invite and support civil society, the voice of civil society, to be part of the solution, as it always has been, and will very much need to be in the future as well.
Yes, I think you definitely have something there as well, because we see the shrinking democratic space, and it's even worse now during the pandemic. So here we also, as you say, we need to show best practices, and we also need to share information, I would say, and also perhaps from time to time be a bit quicker as well, just to see the solutions and how we can work together. But when you're talking about these things, when you're out and you're, I would imagine now that you're also doing this digital during the webinars and the digital meetings, but when you're speaking to different leaders and for countries and different organizations, what kind of responses do you get when you sort of bring forward these opinions of yours?
So I think we live in a time of really big contradictions. I mean, as we speak, we have the general debate in the General Assembly, and the very idea of international development cooperation and multilateral solutions to these global challenges is actually being contested. But having said that, we know for sure from the United Nations Development Programme, working in a wide range of issues, I mean, poverty reduction, inequalities, but also within the field of environment, climate change, and also the field of democratic governance and rule of law and human rights, that there are always in a country possibilities to find these change makers in the public sphere, but also then in the private sphere and among civil society. So we need to build coalitions. This was very much the basis of the decision about the Sustainable Development Goals, that we need to work together. And we need to take that responsibility as the UN to make full use of our platform, but we also would want you and civil society organizations to look for us and see how we can come together in a country to identify also the change makers and the areas, the concrete areas where we can bring forward also ideas and solutions that would actually appeal also to decision makers, because of course they are also looking for different solutions. I think there are many more possibilities than we see sometimes. There is much more dialogue going on, and we should just concentrate on that to see to that we keep the dialogue ongoing, but also that the dialogue is really looking for complete solutions and that can drive change for people in real life. Because that's the way we need to rebuild the trust and the social contract also in society. The trust is very much broken, we can see, in between decision makers and people in many of the countries across the world.
Yes, thank you so much. I think this is super important that we sort of look for change makers, as you say, and that we can do that in different sectors, and that we can collaborate and have different alliances perhaps, and share information, and also look at the positive things, as you say, and use the tools that we have in the Strategic Development Goals here. I think that's also very good. We have quite a lot of things going on already. So thank you so much, Ulrika, for sharing this with us now, and I do hope and wish you all the luck in your important work so far, and we will talk again soon to see how we have been identifying these change makers in your work in UNDP and in our work within civil society. So thank you so much for this time today.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you for receiving. Best of luck in your important work.
Okay, thank you so much.
Okay, so we listened to Ulrika and she had many, many important things to say. I do hope all of you got something really interesting points for further discussions, but also for being able to pose questions. We will very soon also talk to our next guest, but I will remind you that it's possible to pose questions, and that will be actually on YouTube and ONVent. So please pose questions. But by this, I would like to say welcome to our next guest, Ugo Gentilini. Very nice to see you, not meet you, but to see you anyway. You're most welcome to this event. How are you today?
Hi, thank you very much for having me. Great pleasure.
Okay, just a moment. I need to say to the technicians that I can't really hear Ugo, so would you please help me with that? I will try to listen very carefully, but the sound at the moment is very, very low, so okay.
Is there anything I can do from my end?
So I hear a bit, I think it's in the studio actually, so I think you're fine, but we will see if they can sort of make it better. Sorry? We see the technicians are, well, we're going on anyway. I will keep my ears extra attention. Okay, so I'm not sure if you had a possibility to listen to Ulrika Moder now when she was speaking. Do you have any immediate reflections on what she said?
No, I think I would concur with every single line that she said, and I think also she was conveying hope, and the fact that sometimes there are opportunities that are around the corner, and that one may not see immediately. And I think that social protection is exactly one of those cases where sometimes in a crisis there are opportunities, and what we see now unfolding in country after country is precisely the recognition of the importance of having a solid social protection system, both before shocks hit, but also in kind of the more day-to-day challenges that people face.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I also thought it was really interesting that she talked quite a lot about change makers and identifying them, because I think that's a crucial role. Don't you agree about that? And also about us collaborating and having lots of cooperation in different sectors. That would be nice, I would say, that perhaps civil society, World Bank and UNDP could do something together, who knows? But all right, so you're working at the World Bank. That's really interesting, isn't it? And you're also working with this social protection system. And as we have been saying, these are crucial now in the situation we're in the world. So what role does the social protection system play in responding to the situation we're in and we're now recovering? What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, look, we are in a situation, as it was just said, where people are facing some huge livelihood risks. We have seen the effects and the increasing poverty, especially in countries where there is high informality. But there are also other risks, like the moment that we have lockdowns and people are asked to stay home. We see that about 96% of houses in developing countries don't meet any of the WHO global standards for COVID. So even housing per se can be a vector for the disease. So there are really all these trade-offs that people face. And imagine for a second what the crisis would have been without the 2 billion people reached with social assistance. We see about 1/5 of the stimulus packages globally devoted funding for social protection, and without it, I think we would have been in a very different and difficult situation. But also at the same time, this unprecedented response didn't occur by accident. I think it's the result of a deliberate and gradual process of learning and investing and experimenting that occurred in the past 15 years. So here I'd like to make 2 points. One is the critical role that evidence played in building this momentum. And we clearly know through scientific research that social protection helps to reduce mortality, improve cognitive and learning and mental well-being among children, increasing the use of social services, increasing food security, reducing gender-based violence, helping to recover diversified livelihoods, and also sparking local economic multipliers. So all this knowledge base really has influenced the scale-up and the uptake of social protection. We also know that countries that did have, more adaptive and scalable systems were in a better position to increase coverage, and do so more rapidly. So even before COVID, we saw that countries that did have a good delivery infrastructure for social protection were able to scale up in 2 weeks. Others that didn't have those sort of standards, it took months. We are, I suspect, still in the middle of the emergency response phase, I think, perhaps with a glimpse at recovery. But but we see lots of innovations even within the emergency space, and cash transfers in particular are not just a fiscal tool. We have seen a lot of unconventional monetary policies. 6 countries had a universal provision of cash transfers to everyone in societies. We have seen a massive amount of practices in better identifying and paying beneficiaries, ways of connecting social insurance and social assistance, like in urban India. And I think we are really, there is, or at least that's my perception of an increased global awareness, almost the start of a movement for social protection.
That's really interesting that you mentioned that, like a global sort of movement about this. So could I sort of interpret you that you're, on a general basis, would be, are you sort of happy with the kind of steps that the governments are taking during this pandemic, or would you have seen more increased actions?
We see that there has been significant action. I think there is no time for complacency at the moment, but what we can certainly state is that I haven't seen this sort of scale up in the past. Consider that the funding, which in many ways is still inadequate for some respects, but it's about 25% higher than the entire spending that went into social protection during the 2008-2009 Great Recession, and we're still in the middle of this.
Are you surprised? Are you surprised about that? That you see quite a number?
As I said before, it's I think it's a result of the past decade or so of increased investment and awareness in the fact that social protection works. So I'm glad to see it. I'm not necessarily surprised, but I'm glad to see this trend. But as you all mentioned before, both of you, it's we are far from being where we perhaps should be.
Exactly.
But almost every country and territory in the world has put in place some sort of social protection measure. We counted over 1,100 measures, and about 60% of those measures are social assistance schemes, so sort of the non-contributory transfers, and about a third of them are just cash transfers. About 17% of the world's population, 1.3 billion people, are covered by these schemes, by cash transfers. These payments during the COVID crisis have been more generous than they were before the crisis. They almost doubled. And if we look at the extent to which pre-existing schemes are now scaled up, the rate of scale up is over 200%. And also, sometimes there are announcements and plans that are not necessarily followed up to. And what we see, though, from our analysis of what were the plans and where countries are in implementation for where information exists, situation is not that bad. In some countries, some in particular in Central America, that gap between plans and implementation is a little wider than elsewhere. But then you have countries like Pakistan or Serbia that had very ambitious plans, and those were largely met.
But that's good news. But could you see, like, how about the most vulnerable? Are we making sure that no one is left behind?
Yeah, no, there are many challenges, of course. We are, I think, heading into sort of a perfect storm of high need, low revenues, and limited tax bases in a number of countries. So spending is going to be a big issue. Our estimates show that in low-income countries, people receive about $4 per person. So that's not much, relative to $695 per person in high-income countries. And a lot of the scale-up that I described was financed through deficits. So financing is going to be a central issue very soon, sustainability. Institutional issues. the humanitarian assistance that has been provided in addition to government responses also has been very helpful, I think, and we see more and more humanitarian assistance that is provided in cash, about 18% of the total. But at the same time, that also tends to go in parallel to what governments are doing, and I think only about 2% of overall humanitarian assistance is channeled through government structure. So there is a challenge of coordination.
So how will we meet that, do you think, that challenge of coordination?
I think things are improving. There are many examples out there of humanitarian assistance and social protection collecting data together. Humanitarians like in the Philippines, for example, before COVID, using government structures to channel humanitarian assistance. The problem is sometimes, in some cases, either government systems don't have the reach to reach everyone in societies, or there are parts of a country that are very hard to reach. So humanitarian assistance does play a very important role in those cases, but it's important also to make sure that to leave capacities behind, and to make sure that what is being done is also part of a broader system, and that there is no duplication of efforts. And I think there are at country level a number of great practices that are going in this direction, and other times this happens to a less extent. But there are also many opportunities that I see coming up, not just the challenges.
That's nice. Please tell us a bit of opportunities, because they are always more interesting to talk about, right? To give us a bit of a hope.
I think that it's great. It's been fascinating for me to see how a country like Morocco has, in order to reach their populations with social protection, they have tapped the information systems of the health sector. And they have cross-checked and integrated databases. We see that there is an enormous infrastructure on payments that's being set up, and that hopefully it will also be useful after the crisis. I think of the banking system used in Brazil, of electronic money providers in Jordan, e-wallets in Namibia and Togo, financial inclusion agents in India, where 200 million women were reached and provided cash transfers because they were part of a financial inclusion program. The use of points of sales, digital tokens, and so-called non-account schemes in Guatemala and Peru, special accounts set up in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and the use of geospatial and satellite images to reach people in urban areas. I think that's something that is happening now, and that is very important. And how do we reach especially informal sector workers in urban areas? And those are kind of the people that didn't qualify for social assistance before the crisis, and can't afford social insurance either. So they're called somewhat the missing middle, and those are very challenging to reach because there is little information about them, little formal contact between the state and them. So what we see now is the creation of those points of contact, the creation through social protection of ways of bringing in those people into the system. We see that happening in Sierra Leone. We see that happening in Liberia, in Nigeria, in Ethiopia, in Madagascar, in Burkina Faso. So, and operating in urban areas is not easy.
It's not, and I think it's really interesting that you give so many positive examples, but I also definitely feel that here that could also be a big role for civil society, because the group you're mentioning here, that's a group that civil society is in contact with. So here we're going back to this with identifying the change makers and the collaboration, right? And how we can put all the very positive things that are happening now together to make 1 + 1 becomes 3 instead, right? So this is something that I will bring with me from this conversation. I think it's really important for us to sort of identify where can we play a crucial part from our different roles, right? I find that you are really sort of feeling that the World Bank can make a change here now, and that you can see that you're actually playing a part to develop something better for the world now? Do you feel that?
I think that crises are eye-openers, and I think it's probably a historical moment when social protection is somewhat reframed and moving from being something that you may have to something that you can't afford not to have. And for the World Bank, it's I wouldn't say it's you know, a new momentum, because social protection was already a key priority, and COVID has certainly cemented and augmented the importance of investing in social protection. I think the kind of investments in the past 10 years increased by a factor of about 4, now of a little over about 20 billion. But there are, I think, all these changes that are occurring. I think there is in policymakers' mind, and I think in the community more widely, there is this recognition of the importance of reaching people directly. You know, many development interventions are key, but fewer are as tangible and concrete and productive like social protection. And
yeah, that's really nice. Actually, we have got a question for you here from someone who's been writing on the internet here. So the question would be like this: do you think that the social protection system will be more generous after the coronavirus crisis, or will there be a case where they will go back to lower levels?
Either scenario is possible, and I think that a lot would depend on, for example, on the financial side, whether those plans can be sustained. I think there is a lot of interest now that we see that transfers were so important on how to make sure that they can be part of the regular system where it makes sense. In other cases, in some countries, this was a purely counter-cyclical response, especially in kind of the higher income end of the spectrum. In other countries, coverage was so low to start with, only about 1/5 of the poorest bottom 20% in the population did get some sort of social protection support. So we were starting from a very low base, and this expansion, I think, has shed light on the importance of having social protection. Whether that's gonna keep being provided at these levels and at this level of generosity would depend on I think the ability of those that get social protection to influence the decision-making process, but also on the ability of governments to sustain those commitments. And as I mentioned, at the moment, a lot of these expansions are financed via deficits. And as Ulrika said, also, I think we need to get new ways of financing. There is a long-standing debate on how to convert certain type of subsidies into more deliberate social protection investments.
So that's interesting, very interesting. I think we will have, so I think you will have a very big role on making, sort of keeping an eye on this, that we will keep the social protection systems. I would imagine that, and the whole of the World Bank, and also, of course, we in our different roles within civil societies and in UNDP also, of course. I would like to thank you so much, Ugo Gentilini, for taking your time to talk to us about these questions today. This has been very interesting, and you have shed light on several of these things, and I'm sure we will get back to these questions. So thank you so much for your appearance today, and that you took your time to talk to us. And have a lovely day.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you
so much.
Okej, tack så mycket för detta. Då avslutar vi denna punkt där vi har pratat mer om pandemin och de utmaningar som är för de mest utsatta, både när det gäller sociala säkerhetssystem och världens och beslutsfattares och regeringars ansvar generellt, och även hur vi i civilsamhället ska bidra till detta. Tack så mycket för det här.